In kimono, yes.
Here we go. Woohoo!
Great dance. I'm so sorry that others cannot see it. It's only me who can see it backstage here on the application. Thank you
Well,
very much for
we have enough trouble
managing.
keeping our audience, so maybe it's better that way.
Well, once again, good morning, Timothy. It's nice to see you this morning again.
Thank you, Maya. Today I am not on the good ship Santana. I'm reporting to you live from my home office here in beautiful downtown Kawasaki.
Great. And well, your home office looks really cozy, at least on the screen. I believe that it's even more so. You feel that there. So thank you once again. And I don't want to keep the YouTube algorithm waiting. So I want to start straight away with the briefing on Japanese politics. And as we go on, of course, we can talk about things that are happening here, not only in the
Great.
politics, also economy, trade, and some other events. The floor is
Great.
yours.
Thank you very much, Maya, and good morning, everybody. Today is June 18th, 2023. Today is episode 123. We know how to count, Maya. Thank you very
We
much
do.
for continuing this 123 consecutive Sundays. Wow. Today, we're going to talk, as usual, about what's going on in Japanese politics. What are the important things that are going on? What are the precursors to telling us what is going to happen in the near term? That's what we've been doing for 123 sessions, and we'll continue it today. I usually start off with what's the hot news on the economy, culture, politics, and then I hone in on what's going on with the prime minister, his cabinet, and that sort of thing. So, in typical fashion, let me tell you that North Korea fired 2 missiles that failed this last week on Wednesday. It was rather nerve-rattling, as these things usually are. These are short-range missiles that were fired by our dear leader. Apparently, they failed. They both flew for about let me see, 850 and 900 kilometers, respectively. They fell into Japan's exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles outside of the coast. So it wasn't a danger to the population, but it is within what is considered by the Western nations to be the exclusive economic zone. Not quite an invasion of the Japanese territory, but it is within the economic exclusive zone, and so it is meaningful there. Both of them were shot. Were apparently they failed in mid-flight. These are short-range missiles that were fired on Thursday evening, and they landed close to Ishikawa Prefecture. So they sent out the United States and Japanese in combination sent out craft to retrieve the debris. They were successful in that and pulling up debris from the ocean floor there. And so this is a continuing escalation of what's going on between North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, but particularly implicating the United States presence in Okinawa and in Guam. You might remember that a couple of weeks ago, they shot another longer range missile whose trajectory was towards Okinawa. It was a satellite. It was designed to be a satellite, a spy satellite, that failed also in mid-flight. And we were told at that time that the North Koreans had planned to have successive flights because they're trying to hone their skills, hone their experience on lofting missiles and particularly satellites, because they want to have eyes on the ground for in geocentric orbit around this region. And they've been trying to do that for quite a while, and they're ramping up these efforts. This perhaps came as a consequence of South Korea the United States and Japan holding military drills, very extensive military drills, some of the largest live fire drills that they've had in about a decade in South Korea, as a show of force and also as honing the interoperability of the three nations. As you know, Japan, South Korea, and the United States have gone into military intelligence sharing cooperation. They're just getting this started. It came out as a consequence of, President Biden encouraging Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon to, get their act together to come closer. They've been really pretty successful at that. The invitation to join G7 was extended by Mr. Kishida, and there does seem to be actually some real progress after such a long time of no progress between Japan and South Korea. For example, they sent in a team. They were invited to come in to observe what's going on in Fukushima and with the release of the nuclear wastewater there. And now this delegation is back in South Korea, explaining to the South Koreans what's going on, to the fisheries, to the importation of Japanese foodstuffs, about the release of the water. And there seems to be some good cooperation there. It is not generating huge protests against Japan, against Japanese releasing this tainted water into the Pacific. But once again, the South Korea is, pretty far away from where Fukushima is, but still, this waste is being planned for release into the Pacific waters this summer. So they're collaborating and sharing this information with South Korea. And similarly with the intelligence gathering on the trajectory and the apertures of these missiles that are being fired by North Korea. So there is a lot of cooperation going on there. And just maybe 2 days after this missile was fired on Wednesday, the American nuclear-powered submarine visited Pusan, the port of Pusan. This is the first time for a nuclear-powered guided missile submarine to visit South Korea in maybe 10 years. So this is a pretty big deal, and it is a signal of this cooperation and this building alliance between the United States and South Korea. And also in this particular case, it doesn't implicate Japan because it's an American nuclear powered submarine, but it is a big deal for the United States to show the flag there, particularly with a guided missile submarine. So this is just a continuing escalation of what's going on. We can anticipate, in fact, it's been reported that there will be more short-range launches coming up probably in the next couple of weeks. So it's something that we should be looking out for. Since they failed in their first attempt to launch a satellite, it looks like there will be other attempts to launch that satellite because it's extremely important from a military point of view. So much to be watching there. The Diet has passed the LGBTQ bill on Friday, just 2 days ago. It passed the lower house on Thursday and then went to the upper house. It's a big deal because Mr. Kishida promised the G7 that he would have legislation that recognizes alternative lifestyles, sexual preference for marriages, same-sex marriages, and that sort of thing. As we all know, Japan is a laggard in that. Among the G7, it is the only country that doesn't have significant protections for that kind of lifestyle. And there was a lot of foot dragging by the LDP on this. There always has been. The bill was promoted to be passed before the G7. It didn't make that, obviously, because it was just passed on Friday by the skin of its teeth. There were several members, just to show that there's a little bit of disunity here. There was some defections from the LDP to vote on this legislation. It did make it through the process, but several people from the LDP decided to refrain from voting. They were absent, they were sick, they were doing something else. They didn't show up for the vote. So as a consequence, it was able to pass, even though they held their noses. The bill actually, under analysis, it really, and even some of the proponents of the bill will say it really doesn't hit the mark. Maybe it would have been better not to touch the bill, not to push it through, because in getting this bill accepted now, it needed to accommodate some of the opposition for having gay rights more recognized. So, for example, there was supposed to be, as the bill was first promoted, an absolute prohibition on discrimination on lifestyles, on gay marriage, on government services to couples who might have children that are of the same sex or whatever. And what it came down with now is that the language is no unfair discrimination. So that just leaves the discussion of what is unfair open to question. So the people who are promoting the bill for a recognition of gay rights are not very satisfied with it. They got the bill passed. It's a little bit late than never. The diet session is going to end this Wednesday, the 21st. So they're really pushing that through. There was actually a lot of legislative action this last week. Primary among them was the immigration bills, the two immigration bills, and the LGBTQ bill that was passed on Friday. So there's more to be seen in that. But what you can tell from this kind of bum rush to the door, there was discussions, you might recall, that the prime minister was considering extending the diet session from the 21st, which is Wednesday, for another week or maybe 10 days. It doesn't look like that has really formed. It is still possible, but I think the extension of the current diet, the ordinary session, was because there was a bit of play in, is there going to be a snap election or not a snap election? And one of the components of that is the Japanese population, by an 80% vote in a poll, they instructed the administration, the diet, the cabinet members, the people that are in the LDP, we really don't want you to have a snap election during the diet session. And so, of course, the politicians listened to that sentiment, and maybe they're not going to have it on the 21st, but maybe if they extend the diet, they can extend the time to call for the prime minister to call for a snap election. If you're following the news very carefully, maybe just as a peripheral thing in the background, you are, but there was great controversy and consternation just on Wednesday. Everybody was asking the prime minister, are you going to close down the diet? Are you going to have a snap election? There was a lot of action there, but I think even those of us who are watching the situation, the calculus is not quite there to encourage the prime minister to close down the House for a snap election. The LDP is just not in position. They would lose too many votes. They would come out of the snap election with fewer seats than they have right now. That would be a disaster for the prime minister. He might have to resign as a consequence of that, probably more likely than he would have to. And the opposition party is trying to force his hand. So there was a motion for a no confidence. It has been played around by the Constitutional Democratic Party for more than 2 weeks. Some threat that it's going to be offered into the mix, maybe around the 8th of this month. So that was last week, and a little bit more action on it earlier this week by the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, Mr. Izumi. And he kind of did and then kind of didn't. And finally he did, knowing well that it wouldn't pass the motion. So he's got a little bit of egg on his face. He's got to explain to his constituents why he wasn't able to more forcefully push the prime minister to close down the House. And just to be clear on this, the vote of no confidence is issued by the opposition party. It's typically issued at the end of the session, around this time of year, because constitutionally the diet needs to have its ordinary session from January until around June or July, depending on how many days they decide it. And a no confidence motion usually comes towards the end of that. The opposition parties, they band together and they criticize the administration by saying they don't have confidence in the cabinet that the prime minister has put together. And if that motion passes, that means that enough members of the opposition vote no confidence, then the prime minister is required to close down the House and restart. That sometimes means a reforming of the cabinet to overcome that, but more likely than not, it requires a dissolution of the lower house, which hasn't happened no confidence motion has not survived over the last 10 years, 12 years in Japanese politics. So it's unlikely to have much merit. And this one didn't either. And I think Mr. Izumi just ended up with a little bit too much gumption and not enough follow through. So that tells you that his position within the Constitutional Democratic Party, which is the number one opposition party, there's the LDP and Komeito in a coalition, and then everybody else is in opposition. The number one opposition party is the Constitutional Democratic Party, and then there are about 5 other political parties. Primary among them, the number 2 is Ishin no Kai, the group out of Osaka, but now it's becoming, it's gaining a little bit more national prominence. You've got the communists, the socialists, and that sort of thing. But they're the biggest one is the Constitutional Democratic Party, and the Ishin no Kai is really coming on strong. They want to have an election, but they want it a little bit later than sooner. I think Mr. Izumi with the Constitutional Democratic Party just wants to push the prime minister off balance and, complain and criticize. So in Japanese politics, as you know, scandal plays a big role in the fact that the prime minister's son had a Christmas party, right? Today is June 18th, a Christmas party that just hit the press 2 weeks ago in Bunshun, and the prime minister was criticized because members of the Kishida family were invited to the prime minister's residence where the prime minister lives. They had a Christmas party. The prime minister showed up. He kind of laughed and had a bit of something to eat. He was in his pajamas. So it wasn't on official business, but it was within the prime minister's residence. And some of the kids who were all there with the prime minister's son, who is the policy secretary for the prime minister. Of the 8 diet secretaries that the prime minister has, he elected to have his son as one of them. And his son, had some friends over. They had a couple of drinks. They took pictures of themselves inside the official residence in poses suggesting, maybe inappropriateness. And so the prime minister was roundly criticized. This broke 2 weeks ago, and you would have thought that this is not a big deal. It's a minor deal, but it is still flourishing in political circles. So the prime minister is a little bit, he wants real wind in his sails and not these little dogs nipping at his heels. He's got that one. And then there was another scandal that came up just this last week where one of his aides, it was released in Bunshun just this last week, has a mistress and going to Disneyland and having the car ready for her, and just anything that you can hook your hat on will do for the opposition, particularly at this point in time. So we've talked about this in the past. Look out for these kind of scandals, whether they have merit or whether they really have any kind of weight in criticizing or in identifying some sort of character flaw in the prime minister or in the prime minister's cabinet. Those are the things that really carry weight if you're going to go towards an election. In any event, the prime minister said over and over this week, he said it last week, I have no intention to close down the House. He said that, prime ministers will all say that until they decide that they're going to close down the House. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but this was a major issue. It does not look like there will be a closing of the House. Especially since the emperor and the empress are on international travel. They won't be back until Friday of next week. Who knows? There could be an extension of the diet and it could come up again. I kind of doubt it. In other news, Google and Apple are under the microscope now by Japanese regulators. I think everybody here knows that, if you have a Google or an Apple phone, you are somewhat restricted to the software that you can download, and people who are producing applications for these phones, either for the Android or for the iPhone, they have to jump through several hoops, and they have to get authorization from Apple or Google to be listed as a provider on their sites. The Japanese antitrust authority has gone after both companies as practicing monopolistic tendencies, and they've put together a panel. It was actually a big topic of conversation just this last week. And I know it's been a topic of conversation in other geographies in the United States as well. But now they're coming down pretty hard. They're forcing Google and Apple to open up their protocols and to let competing vendors not only have their wares on Google and Apple appliances, but also to prevent them from having preferential treatment to their homegrown applications. So, for example, when you buy your phone, you start it up. There are a bunch of apps that are automatically loaded. Those are usually, excuse me, native apps to Google or to Apple, and you just start your interaction with your cell phone with those applications already going. So they've said you have to stop that, and also for these applications that want to sell services or some kind of new feature, Google, not Google Maps, but maybe their map preference or their map applications, they have to go through the provider payment system. And it prevents it. Not only does it mean that they have to pay a premium for that because they're not Google, they're not Apple, they are a third-party provider. Maybe they're not a preferred vendor. So it increased the cost. It really restricts people from participating in that market. And with Google and Apple having such a stranglehold over the iPhone market, even in Japan, I don't know if you've followed this, but even in Japan, the homegrown phones here are just not up to muster. They are being crushed by Apple and Google, and given the trends, they just won't exist. It'll only be Apple and Android in very near term. So I think this is why the administrators are jumping on the bandwagon and considering these regulations. So this is coming down the path. There will be regulations that are being produced right now. They had a meeting on Friday, and they also published that they will be taking these rules and regulations that they are kind of chewing on now and submitting that as a bill for a law in the next diet session. So we're in diet session number 155 now. And as I said, constitutionally, the diet needs to open up in January. So they've already telegraphed that come January, in the next session, the next 120-day session of the diet, they are going to be promoting a legislation to clamp down on these two providers. In other news, excuse me for the throat. You might have followed that there was the death of an upper house member, Aoki, Mikio Aoki. He was a very prominent LDP member. He was in the upper house, and his death at 89 years old provides us to kind of look retrospectively at his career and what he did and what he stood for to help us understand what's going on right now. So let me tell you a little bit about this individual, and you can kind of extrapolate from this about other members of the diet, how they got into the diet, how they became prominent, what they did during their terms of office, and why they might have been identified as somebody with leadership qualities, even though, like Mr. Aoki, he only started out as a mere diet secretary, as I was a diet secretary. So he started out as a diet secretary for Noboru Takeshita before he became prime minister. So he was Mr. Takeshita's diet secretary. Mr. Takeshita came from, let me see, where was he? In Shimane, I believe. And Mr. Aoki was his diet secretary at a time that I was a diet secretary. So I was a diet secretary in 1982, 1983. Mr. Aoki was also the diet secretary for Mr. Takeshita during that time. And then he ran for prefectural office because he had the endorsement of Mr. Takeshita. Mr. Takeshita would soon become prime minister, so that he got the endorsement of the prime minister or the soon-to-be prime minister. I think Mr. Takeshita was minister of finance at the time. So it was kind of an easy win for his diet secretary to win an LDP slot. It was in the upper house, not in the lower house. So these are 6-year terms. And he received his his diet badge. I think in 2019, I'm sorry, in 1919. So he has been in the diet for about 30 years before he died. I think he resigned from the diet in 2010. So he became member of the upper house, and then he became chief cabinet secretary under Keizo Obuchi. Keizo Obuchi is noteworthy because he died in office in April of 2020. He had a stroke. So he was chief cabinet secretary, which is probably in the closest person to the prime minister. He speaks on behalf of the prime minister. He gives these press briefings. These press briefings are almost daily nowadays, but back in the day then they weren't as frequent. But the chief cabinet secretary position has always been a stepping stone to become prime minister. That didn't happen with Mr. Aoki, but other things did. So, for example, on Mr. Obuchi's deathbed, it is reported, Mr. Aoki reported, that he visited the prime minister while he was there, and he regained consciousness. He had a stroke, and he was sedated. But while Mr. Aoki was there, Mr. Aoki reported that he regained consciousness, reached out and touched him on the shoulder and said, "Look, while I'm in bed and I can't do things, I want you to step in as my prime minister while I'm being ill. So you take care of things, okay, conk." He died about 10 days later, but Mr. Aoki used this opportunity to kind of insert himself as prime minister after that, until there was an election for the new prime minister, which he had a heavy hand in. So during that time, it was a lot of controversy because you just don't do that. But everything happened so quickly. There was a lot of confusion. For a prime minister to die in office, I mean, it just so rarely happens. They didn't have a real method or procedure for handling that. So into this vacuum swooped Mr. Aoki. He took reins, he controlled things. And then of the other 5 LDP members who were critical in determining who would be the replacement for Mr. Obuchi, it was Mr. Aoki and 4 others who decided that it would be Mr. Mori. Mr. Mori at that time was he was the leader of the Abe faction. And Mr. Mori, you might remember, most recently was the chairman of the Olympic Committee. He resigned because of remarks that he made about women. And he's still very prominent in the Abe faction. But this story continues to have meaning for us because after Mr. Mori became prime minister, the Secretary General at that time, actually the Secretary General at that time was Mr. Mori. He was promoted to prime minister. This controversy just continued to go on, and probably not only is Mr. Aoki a member of the upper house and the prime minister never comes from the upper house, but he still retained power there. The interesting thing about this is that the faction that he was the leader of is currently the Motegi faction. And so he's been in the background of the Motegi faction ever since he resigned. He resigned in 2010, but he's still been active. He just gave up his diet badge, but he's still very prominent. He's an advisor to prime ministers. Everybody relies on him. He has the 3rd largest faction. He's got Mr. Motegi as his step-in, who has the titular head of the Motegi faction. But the problem here is that the prime minister, the former prime minister's daughter, so when Mr. Obuchi died, or before he died, and he whispered to Mr. Aoki, probably something along the lines of, my daughter is going to run for office. I want you to take an eye out for her, keep her under your wing, make sure that everything's going well for her. That seems to have been coming to fruition over the last couple of years because Mr. Motegi is having a little bit of difficulty maintaining forces within the Motegi faction. And one of the reasons for that is because Miss Obuchi is a prominent leader within the Motegi faction. And the the word is that the prime minister really is kind of chafing at Mr. Motegi being the secretary general of the LDP. And he's got other ideas for that. He's got two candidates, but one of them being promoted by Mr. Aoki is someone you don't want to ignore. You need to take their voices into concern, is to have Miss Yuko Obuchi as the Secretary General to replace Mr. Motegi. So that's been going on under the background, kind of under the covers, but Mr. Motegi is not having, full sway, even though he is Secretary General. He's still generating a lot of power being in that position. When there is going to be a race for the prime minister, definitely Mr. Motegi is going to be there. Definitely Kono Taro is going to be there. And this controversy that keeps coming up over the last couple of weeks with the My Number system is diminishing Mr. Kono Taro's standing distinctly if he becomes a candidate for prime minister, which we can all anticipate. The fact that the My Number system is suffering from these lapses, it's not really moving as smoothly as the government wants it to or as it was promoted, will reflect on Kono Taro, and people will say, well, you're not really fit to be prime minister because remember what happened with the My Number system. So this is going to come up in the next 18 months or so, because the prime minister's term of office ends in September of 2024. Similarly, you might remember or have heard that a couple of self-defense forces soldiers were killed this last week. There was a shooting at a rifle range in Gifu. An 18-year-old recruit who had just joined the self-defense forces in April, May, June. He's been a recruit for 3 months. That means he passed basic training. He's probably in more intensive training because they already go through rifle training and real fire during basic training. Basic training typically lasts, 10 weeks. So this 18-year-old, for some reason, lost his cool. He shot one of the instructors twice, killing him. He shot one of the other fellows, a 25-year-old soldier who is also an instructor, and he shot a third one who received a pretty serious wound to his leg. But the first two individuals he shot were killed. In this instance, Mr. Hamada, who is the defense secretary, is going to suffer as a consequence. This happened under your watch. So like with scandals we were talking about earlier with the prime minister's son, or with his chief, one of his diet member aides who is very close to him, having a mistress, these kinds of things really pull the prime minister down and pull the opinion polls down. So they are very powerful, even though they have just a very tiny, real impact on government or policies or how actually the prime minister is doing. But it is the fodder that really pushes Japanese politics. So I don't mean to put too much weight on it, but it is important to point them out. These kinds of things are reported in Bunshin Weekly, and we report to you on them when they are of importance. So not finally, I've got maybe 4 other things I want to talk about, but on Tuesday, the cabinet approved a package of policies to address Japan's declining birth rate. They made a big deal out of this. So the prime minister, he came back, he was on G7, a lot of fanfare there. That was ended about 3-4 weeks ago. The prime minister has been in Tokyo the entire time, no foreign visits. He's been working on politics and closing various administrative bills and the legislation. So he's been really busy. One of the hallmarks of his administration is defense spending, increase that 100% from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. That is one of his hallmark policies. And the other one is to address Japan's declining birth rate at an unprecedented level. That means he is going to address it at an unprecedented level. And he's finally had this meeting with the, what was it? The, let me see, it was, it was one of the committees that he is sitting on for declining birth rates. And they passed a package without really talking too much about where the money is going to come from. But some of the details we have already reported on. He has already talked about that. For every year moving forward from this next fiscal year, 3.5 trillion yen will be devoted to the declining birth rate for every year for 3 years. So the increase in the defense budget to go from 1% to 2% requires 4 trillion yen every year. So to address the declining birth rate, 3.5, that's almost as much as the defense expenditures increase. So this is a phenomenal amount. Where it's going to come from has been left to be decided later. He said enthusiastically that he would address that issue before the close of the year. So today is June, and you've got another 6 months left. That's not very encouraging, but this is $25 billion per year to be devoted to this, to addressing this issue. What it involves is currently, if you have a child in Japan under a certain, and you are under a certain economic income level, you get 15,000 yen per child per month. And if they are less than 2 years old, you get that. And then if they're older than 2 years old, you get 10,000 yen. They're changing that now. They're taking away that income level. So anybody who has a child gets that money. And if you have a third child, it goes up to 30,000 yen, which is actually 30,000 yen. They should have started with 30,000 yen. I think maybe that would be more encouraging for families to have more children. But this is, I guess, the best that they can do. They're pushing up the age for people to receive that, and they're also earmarking funds so that if you're going to take off for childcare because you're the husband, or you're going to take off of work, your salaries will be guaranteed during that period of time. So they're really doubling down to make sure that the environment is conducive to having children. They also have toyed with the idea of people in that age bracket. So you finish high school, maybe you get married, and maybe to your child production, most likely child production years, maybe until you're 34, 35 or whatever, they will guarantee a salary so that you have the hope and inspiration because your income is going to be enough to support that. So I don't know how everybody else feels about that. You know, people who are 45 years old, they've already had, 1.2 kids, they're putting them through college, and these young kids are getting a guaranteed salary that might be better than or at par with what they're getting. It's going to create a little bit of controversy, but they really have to pull the rabbit out of the hat. And it's unclear, even now, how the prime minister is going to pay for that. He is under some criticism, but this was a big item this last week, and I wanted to touch on it with you. In automobile news, there's a couple of things going on there. Toyota had its annual general shareholder meeting this last week. Akio Toyoda, who was the CEO, he moved up from CEO to chairman. He was going to retire, and in this last shareholder meeting, it was decided, probably by him, that maybe it's a little bit too early to retire as chairman. I already gave up the CEO position, and my replacement, a fellow by the name of Koji Sato as CEO, he's going to be doing well. So Koji Sato, the new CEO of Toyota, looks good, has the same kind of haircut as everybody else at the upper level does, is going to be driving that bus. And his motto now is EV first. Maybe taking a cue from the governor of Tokyo, Tokyoites First, the name of the party that she formed. EV first, that is his motto now, and it looks like Mr. Toyoda is going to stay at the helm in the chairman's position. So every year the companies have their annual shareholder meeting. It has somewhat declined in prominence. It used to be a place where Sokaya and these people who wanted to criticize the administration or criticize the company or just be a rabble rouser in anticipation that somebody would pull them aside and say, look, why don't you give up your shares? I'll give you a market value plus 10 for the shares that you hold, and don't show up to any more shareholder meeting. That has been a tried and true way of the underworld and unscrupulous people to make money and raise a lot of controversy during these shareholder meetings. It happens there. Similarly, Nissan Motors. Nissan, as you remember, their CEO was Carlos Ghosn, who escaped in, 20 2019, December of 2019. He escaped Japan and now is in Lebanon. But they had their shareholder meeting, and it turns out that their COO, Ashwani Gupta, who was instrumental in this whole controversy when Carlos Ghosn was running the company, he was identified very quickly as a consequence of Mr. Ghosn being ejected from the position. And during that whole controversy, when he was under investigation and under house arrest and that sort of thing, Mr. Gupta was the COO, and it looks like he has been forced out. So no crocodile tears for him. Nissan is always going to be suffering because of that huge thing that happened with Carlos Ghosn and the alliance between Renault and Nissan. That still is continuing to go on, but not with Mr. Gupta. So they've invited him to take the door. He was, you know how these things happen in big corporations, but particularly in Nissan. Somebody in the audit committee received some criticisms of Mr. Gupta. They did their investigation, and their investigation showed that there were some inadequacies, and this was all pointed out and blamed at the COO. And so he was invited not to extend his term as a board member, and so he will be resigning effective immediately. But the combination between Renault and Nissan, it was at one point that Renault owned 34% of Nissan, and in a cross shareholding, Nissan held about 15 or 14% of Renault. And that was part of the controversy, that the French owned a whole lot of Nissan, and Nissan, it wasn't reciprocated, but it was at a time when they were in real trouble. So who wants to remember history? And Carlos Ghosn was brought in to help fix that, and who wants to remember that either? But currently, this 20-year alliance with Renault, currently it is about 15% more parity, but they're really focusing on building other companies, for example, one that it focuses exclusively on EV vehicles. So it is something, there will be more news about Nissan, because, the Japanese automobile industry is the engine of growth for the Japanese economy. Of all industries that Japan excels at, it's the automobiles that is at the tip of the iceberg. And it explains why Mr. Toyota was for so long the chairman of Keidan Ren, or why they wield so much weight within Japanese politics, in fact. So it's something to mull over. It will continue to be something of a topic for us, although it doesn't really particularly impact Japanese politics. It is an engine of economic growth for the country, and it will receive a lot of scrutiny from the government. So the Meteorological Agency has now acknowledged that El Nino is a thing. We are in El Nino now. This typhoon that we had, I think Maya opened up today's briefing with some talk about, the typhoon having passed. We had beautiful days. Maybe Friday it rained, but Saturday and today are just beautiful days. The typhoon has gone through, cleaned out the atmosphere, and we have sunshine and mild weather. So we are in Tsuyu, but this is the earliest for a typhoon to be striking Japan. And the Meteorological Agency says, watch out, because there's going to be more of that. With the onslaught of El Nino, there will be more rain and heavier and stronger typhoons this year. There is typically an average of about 25 typhoons that hit Japan every year. They have predicted that there will be 29 this year. They've started earlier, and they will go later. Typically, they are at the end of July, sometimes in August and in September. That's the typical season. It started a little bit early, and it will go a little bit later. That is what they have predicted to us. Another policy engagement that the Prime Minister had just this last week was on Wednesday. He joined the Council for Gender Equality, and they approved a raft of policies that they are going to enforce among stock companies that are listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So the council approved that, and you probably read this in the press, that their desire is to have boards of these Tokyo listed companies, especially the big ones, to have 30% of their board represented by women. That means of the board members that are there, 30% should be women by 2030. And to kind of goose it, by 2025, there should be at least one in all of these boards. So if you're, if you haven't been promoting women in your structure for the last couple of years, you're not going to have anybody appropriate or trained or kind of eligible to sit in that atmosphere and to be very useful. But, at the same time, you have noticed that women have been appointed to several boards here, either as in an advisory capacity or as a full-term board member. It has happened. There have been a couple of foreigners that have been appointed to boards. But I think it is this push, even if it's not perfect, they're not men, so they don't have the same experience that men do. They need to have this training. They need to have this exposure. So the Japanese government is putting teeth into that. They are going to require these companies. They're going to have the Bourse, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, issue policies and rules with penalties if these companies don't have 30% or if they don't have these kind of policies in place. So this is really starting to come on with a vengeance. They have also said that the discrepancy between the wage of the salaries of women and men, what that discrepancy is, needs to be published. Currently, if you have a company of 300 people or more, which is like less than 1% of all Japanese companies, you need to publish that data. You need to reveal that to the Japanese government. They want to push that to 100. If you have 100 or more employees in your company, you need to publish this data on wage discrepancies. And the Prime Minister has said, he joined this meeting on Wednesday. He said, this is an issue of utmost importance. We want to set rules and an action plan at the soonest possible time, and we're going to be hitting that. So part of that you think is maybe posturing, but I think he's already decided that he's not going to be looking for the women vote because of a snap election. He might have moved a little bit more aggressively had that been the plan. But I think really for the LDP, for Japanese politics, for the Japanese economy, they really need to do something to bring the women more into the fold. I mean, the declining birth rate, most of the pundits don't believe whatever the Prime Minister says he's going to do is going to make much of an impact. Probably it's going to be with AI, with robotics, and bringing in the distasteful foreigners to fill in the gaps. So that's more likely the scenario that we're going to be facing. So the Prime Minister is addressing that piecemeal, going one-on-one, but there is a lot of action that's going on there. So LGBTQ, the women's issue, the Foreign Workers Act to replace the temporary workers regulations that were in place until just recently. It received so many criticisms. So we're kind of moving into a new area here. The Prime Minister needs to encourage the economy and encourage the voters to admire him for what he's doing. He is, as we all know, he's well regarded in terms of diplomacy and foreign relations, but with regard to domestic issues, he's having a bit of a tough time. And even within the LDP, his faction is fourth largest. There's been some movement there. I'd like to report those to you as well. But as it stands right now, the LDP has 262 members of the 465 House seat lower house. So they have a majority in the lower house. They have 262 compared to the all available seats that are there, 465. But with their coalition partner, Komeito, they have a supermajority. They have not quite 2/3, but they've got 294 of that whole number. Komeito only provides 32 new members to that coalition. So it's not a great amount. And I think the coalition between Komeito and the LDP is really an electoral relationship. Whenever there is an election, the Komeito in those districts it can't support or provide a candidate, it will tell its members, you vote for the LDP here because they're going to help us over there. And then there are other districts where Komeito has a seat or has a shot at a seat, and they negotiate with the LDP, don't put an LDP person here. Because if you do that, the likelihood of us winning a seat is very bad. We only have 32 seats now. We'd like to end up with 38. So help us out here, help a pal. So that balance has been maintained. It is now fractured. It is suffering from the potential of having a lower house snap election, and everything kind of bubbled up to the surface. So there are a couple of fights that are going on now between Komeito and the LDP, and it has probably encouraged the not probably, I think it distinctly has encouraged the prime minister not to hold this snap election that we have been toying with for the last 2 months or so. So the opposition party is led by the Constitutional Democratic Party, as we mentioned at the beginning of this briefing. And it looks like they're suffering because they toyed with this no confidence motion to force the hand of the prime minister. It was on again, off again, and then they formally submitted it on Friday. It just sunk. It didn't have the force of the opposition parties joining together. But even if they did have a chance to come together, it probably wouldn't have passed because there's just not enough controversy. There's not enough negative weight aimed at the prime minister or aimed at the cabinet. They've been very good at keeping the number of scandals down. So it's kind of a tepid atmosphere. So the no confidence motion didn't survive, and the prime minister is feeling like, I can't hold a snap election because if I do, I'm going to lose. The LDP is going to lose seats. Instead of going into the election with 262 members, I'm going to end up with less than, well, the predictions are he would end up with around 200 members. That would really that would kill his chances of continuing to be prime minister. And he's got a couple of people in the wings, Mr. Motegi in particular, who would like to have a shot at that job. Mr. Motegi is one of the people who is standing in line to do that, although everybody says, as they usually do, there's nobody who can stand up to Mr. Kishida. He's the only one we've got. We don't have anybody better. The same refrain that you've heard over and over again. So just to remind you, the lower house doesn't go for an election until October of 2025. So we've got plenty of time there. The prime minister doesn't need to close down the house. The more likely scenario is that even without extending the diet, let's say the diet ends on Wednesday as it is predicted to, and the diet goes into recess, probably within a couple of months, maybe during August, which is Obon, or maybe during a supplementary session in September or October, he will revise the cabinet. So definitely he wants to get the Secretary General out, and maybe Miss Obuchi would be the replacement candidate there, or it could even be the leader of the Moriyama faction, Mr. Moriyama, as the next Secretary General of the LDP. There's a lot of play there, and it's not really being talked up very much, but it's something that you on this briefing should continue to consider and keep in mind. So with regard to LDP factions, there are 5 factions, 6 factions. There's also loosely knit groups or associations that are not quite factions yet. But of the established factions, there's the Abe faction, the Aso faction, the Motegi faction, the Kishida faction, the Nikai faction, and the Moriyama faction. They have other formal names for them, but usually the nomenclature is that the leader takes kind of the name of the faction. Mr. Abe is no longer with us, but still the Abe faction continues. The numbers have changed just a tiny bit. I want to report that to you because every time there is a defection or an addition to any one of the factions, it's a signal of something going on. There's something to be watched there. It's not very big or very dramatic, but the timing is interesting. So the Abe faction stays at 100 members. The Aso faction increased by 1 more. So he's had maybe 3 additions over the last maybe 2 months, 3 months. He's now at 56. So a little bit less than half the Abe faction. I'm sorry, a little bit more than the Abe faction, but he's at the number 2 slot with 56. The next one is Mr. Motegi's faction, who used to be with Mr. Aoki, Mr. Aoki's faction. Mr. Aoki just recently passed away. We had a little bit of a discussion about that. So he is standing still at 54. So he is the third largest faction. Mr. Kishida is the fourth largest faction. He did have 56 members. He's lost a member, and now he is standing at 45. So that's somewhat interesting why that would have happened. Mr. Nikai, who was the Secretary General throughout the entire Abe administration, very powerful, very close to China, very close to the Komeito, and just a real deal maker. His faction is still very powerful. He's a little bit old. He's walking with the cane, but he's still a member of the Diet. He's still the leader of his faction. That stands still at 41. And then the Moriyama faction increased from 7 to 8. So it's not a large faction, but Mr. Moriyama continues to hold a lot of power. And were there to be a cabinet reshuffle and he was to be elected as the Secretary General, that would really boost up his standing. The other kind of interesting thing that I'd like to report to you is, you might remember that the Abe faction is kind of leaderless. We've been waiting for them to come together to coalesce their forces. There are probably 5, maybe 4 real contenders to replace Mr. Abe, but actually not really, because none of them really rise to that level. I mean, even when Mr. Abe was asked to promote one of his own to be prime minister, he didn't select anybody from his faction. He went out of his faction and promoted somebody else, a kind of a slap in the face to all of the members. But that's how much power he wielded, and that's how much bigger he was than any of the other contenders. So none of them can muster it. The idea was floated out a couple weeks ago. How about Mr. Suga? How about Mr. Suga, who has a faction, who has an association of members, actually a pretty large association. There are at least 20 who are grouped with him, and it could be as many as 40. These are people who belong to other factions, but also independents who appreciate and admire Mr. Suga. He hasn't formed a faction. He was the only prime minister in history to not be a faction head and to become prime minister, because he was tapped by Mr. Abe, not on his deathbed like Mr. Obuchi was. Mr. Aoki was during Mr. Obuchi's stroke, but he was tapped by Mr. Abe to be the prime minister, and Mr. Abe stepped back. He took a break, as he had done in the past. So, you know, if you put yourself in the position of the Abe faction, we don't have the power. We have the largest faction. We have 100 people, but with this fractured leadership, we don't have the ability to control things. When Mr. Abe was here, he could control things. Mr. Kishida would have to go to him. Mr. Suga had to go to him for anything of importance or even unimportant things to get his approval, because without the support of the Abe faction, nothing's going to happen within the LDP. And without the LDP working in combination, nothing's going to happen in the Diet. So the fact that the Abe faction is so large, but doesn't have a one voice to speak through it, is really diminishing things. So the idea was, and think about the power and the attractiveness of having Mr. Suga step in with conditions. Obviously, I think if it was my idea, I would say, we're going to make you the head of the Abe faction. You're going to be the leader to coalesce us. Please bring in some of your group members. We'll treat them well, but we don't want you to run for prime minister. We want you to be the titular head, the leader, to help us focus our energies. But the next prime minister, the Abe faction endorsement of the next prime minister will be one of us 4. And I could see something like that coming up. But they really do need to come off their indecision right now, because one of the reasons why the prime minister is having so much trouble is because the LDP is not playing a central role in Japanese politics as it was while Mr. Abe was alive. So they're still kind of dealing with that issue. Let me see. In anticipation of a snap election, the LDP finalized the candidates for the 18 remaining candidates for the new 134 districts. So that means that there are districts that are coming up because of 1010, because of the new gerrymandering, and they needed to have candidates to run in those districts. This process has been going on for ever since 1010 was insisted upon by the Supreme Court, and the LDP accepted that they would take 10 from the rural areas and distribute them to the more urban areas. But it has caused some controversy. So the biggest controversy is in Yamaguchi 3. So in Yamaguchi, which is the prefecture of the foreign minister, Hayashi, it is also the prefecture of Mr. Abe, and it is the prefecture of the defense minister, Mr. Kishi, who was Mr. Abe's brother, younger brother. He resigned. His oldest son ran in the election. He received that seat, but that was with 4 districts in Yamaguchi. Under 1010, one of the districts is being eliminated. So that means you've got Mr. Kishi, you've got Mr. Hayashi, and you've got Mr. Abe's replacement running there. And the controversy here is, although Mr. Hayashi is number 2 in the Kishida faction, he's very prominent. He was in the upper house. He's left the upper house in the last election to run in the lower house so that he could at some point become prime minister. Obviously, that is the move. So he was in the upper house. He's moved to the lower house. He's very popular, but this fight within Yamaguchi has always been between the Hayashi legacy and the Abe legacy. So this goes back generations and generations. Mr. Hayashi's father used to fight with Mr. Abe's father, and these fights were very famous and very pronounced. They were in different factions, and this fight continues. Here's the mix. So in the last election, there was a by-election for District 3, which is one of the districts that's going to disappear under 1010. So in this last by-election, there was still, under the former rules, this election is going to occur, and Miss Abe, the prime minister's wife, decided to select somebody to run in her deceased husband's place. The key here is that in the next election for the lower house, so if there was going to be a snap election, this seat would disappear. And we don't know what would happen with this individual who was supported by Miss Abe. So you have to be pretty brave and pretty strong to run in that election district, knowing that in the next election, that seat is going to disappear. So there's been lots of controversy about who is going to run in this combined seat. Mr. Hayashi, who already holds the seat in the contiguous area, number 2, and number 2 and 3 have gone together. So it is a fight between Mr. Hayashi, who is in the Kishida faction, and current foreign minister, against the person that was identified by Aki Abe. And let me see, his name is Yoshida Shinji. So Yoshida Shinji, if there is going to be a fight, and if there's going to be a fight between Seiwakai and the Kishida faction, Seiwakai can bring lots of pressure to bear on a fight in this combined district that would pit the current foreign minister against a newcomer to Japanese politics, or into national politics, Mr. Yoshida. So the prospect of this fight coming up might have been another one of the reasons why the prime minister decided, I'm going to push this down the road. I don't want to have that fight. I don't want my current foreign minister to be in a fight with Seiwakai, with the Abe faction, and get defeated. He would have, that would be a disaster. He would have to resign in disgrace as a consequence of that. He would lose his seat. I don't want to do that. I want to push that ball down the road. So it's one of the complications that you're not going to hear enough of, and especially as we go into an election season. This snap election could happen. It could happen at any time, obviously, but it's not going to happen without us having a little bit more of an insight into it. The other thing that prevents Mr. Kishida from having a snap election and calling for an election is that it does require the prime minister, the emperor, to come in and close down the house. It requires the emperor to come in and open the house after the election. And it turns out, excuse me, that the emperor and the empress are now visiting Jakarta. They'll be there for the whole week. They left yesterday and they'll be there until Friday. I don't know if that was by design, but the prime minister really can't do anything unless perhaps he extends the Diet session, and then towards the end of the Diet session, he calls for a snap election. A lot can happen in these next 10 days. So please continue to watch. Please tune in this next week. And also, just to wrap things up, Mr. Kishida is scheduled to be visiting the Gulf states in July. And usually when we get this news, it has been discussed roundly within the Prime Minister's office. It probably is in early July. The Diet session ends on the 21st without an extension. If it does get extended, it will probably end before the end of this month, even with an extension. And then he's going to be traveling to the Gulf states. Just the dynamics do not indicate any sort of movement or accommodation to a snap election. So I'll put it there. There's not going to be a snap election. And I think most people would agree with that. Maya, that's it for a roundup of what's going on in Japanese politics. I'm available to stick around and take questions and have discussions with people who are in the audience on issues of their importance. So for today, that's about it. One of these days, you're going to turn on your mic. I know that because I have experience in this.
Apologies. Well, I tried to save the trouble for you, because when my mic is open, actually, I think that it disturbs you a bit. Apologies.
Yeah.
For that. And thank you. Yes. Okay. So we have a question in Clubhouse, but also I want to ask you something, because you talked about Misobuchi and how she entered politics and the machinations there and so on. But also there is something else. I think that we have also seen other examples of that when the husband, a prominent politician, passed away, and then his wife actually enters politics, even though she seemingly doesn't have the, let's say, the credentials and the necessary qualifications.
Yeah.
Well, so I wonder, isn't there any legislation that actually regulates these things here in Japan? Because to me, it sounds like more dynastic dealings, or how can I put it? I don't want to use stronger words, but it's really, viewed from outside, it doesn't look like something which is quite democratic, actually.
Well, that's always been one of the criticisms of Japanese politics, that it is hereditary. It's somewhat dynastic. It passes from father to son, and sometimes when it can't pass from father to son, it passes to the wife. But that's kind of the way Japanese culture works. These kinds of indebtedness, the gratitude that you feel, can be passed down to a family member. It is harder to pass it down to a hired hand. So we talked about Toyota Motor Company. Mr. Toyota is the son of the founder, right? And he's now assigned that to the CEO. There is a textural difference when that kind of dynasty changes hands. And similarly in Japanese politics, because it is all about doing favors for people, collecting kind of goodwill, and kind of using that at a time when you need to. You just store it up. You don't kind of thump people in the chest and say, don't you remember what I did for you? Or do you remember what my father did for you? But here in Japan, it is very much like that. And so that's why these things become more dynastic in nature. Miss Abe was toying with the idea. Actually, I think the Abe faction was trying to push her into that kind of mold. She refused doing it. I don't think she would have been appropriate for it. But had she done that, then I think this controversy about leadership within the Abe faction would be a separate issue, and maybe she would have stepped in there, and that would have worked. Very interesting, but good question.
And you mentioned also that did I understand you well? That she identified Mr. Yoshida as the possible leader. So this was the wife of
Yes,
Prime
this was her.
Abe
This was
who-
her candidate. Yeah.
How come? I mean, that's also something very curious. Like somebody who is not involved in politics.
Oh, he was involved in politics, just not
No,
at the
I mean,
national level.
She was not.
She
But
was not.
the
But
one who identified him.
no, but that tells you just how much power and authority somebody in that position holds. Yeah, it continues on, and that's
Okay.
why I think a lot of companies also, restaurants, law firms, some manufacturing companies, they pass down from father to son. It usually, I think, in a historical perspective, it doesn't last beyond 3 generations or 4 generations. The younger generations become kind of complacent and with expectations that they are due their benefits. But here in Japan, it's frequently a criticism, but I think it's one of the underpinnings, one of the strong underpinnings of Japanese politics.
Yeah, because you mentioned the private sector, and I can see how things there shouldn't be that controversial. Because if the company is owned by the family, it kind of goes, logically that probably it will be passed from one generation to another. But in
Right.
politics, there is nothing private there. So Japan is supposed to be a democracy, and it is actually. It is a democracy, but there are things that are really curious happening there, and yeah, it makes you
Well,
scratch your head.
yeah. I mean, you have to be careful too. I mean, many people say that the United States is a democracy, and kind of, yeah, it is one of the bastions of democracy in the free world. But I think many people would say it's not quite a democracy, one man, one vote. Here in Japan, it's not quite a democracy, as the Supreme Court has identified that one man, one vote is not accurate. The people in the rural areas, the reason why we have 10-10 is because one man equals 2.3 votes in the rural areas. And when you're in the big cities, your vote counts far less than comparatively. So, yeah, it's about free speech. It's about democracy. You have to be careful making those analogies.
Well, there are different aspects of democracy, I believe, and well, some of them are cultural. The most important, I believe. Okay, so we have a couple of comments and questions in Clubhouse, so let me go through them. The first one is from Bruce. Can you get more detailed about when the seat in Yamaguchi is going away? So when is that?
The seat in Yamaguchi has already gone away. So it's a great question because in this seat only, so when they had the by-election, they had 5 seats. 1 was in the upper house, 4 were in the lower house. Of the 4 seats in the lower house, the one in Yamaguchi, the way that the election was held was under the old rules because Mr. Abe was assassinated, and then they had to have a replacement for him, and then they had the by-election. But when he was assassinated and when they decided to have the election, it was before 2023, December 31st, December 2022. And the new law took effect in January 1st, 2023. So these other elections have to be operated under the new rules, and only in Yamaguchi was the old rules applied. So when he ran for election, there shouldn't have been a 3rd district. So that district evaporates as soon as there is a snap election or another election for the lower house.
Well, thank you for that.
It's a little bit confusing, and I commend you, Bruce, for identifying that, because without a careful eye, you're not going to catch it. But that is a complexity here. 10-10 is coming. This was the first time for 10-10 to be exercised. So that's one of the worries with the LDP, with the prime minister, on holding a snap election, because 10-10 now comes into force. And under certain arrangements, without Komeito voting for these new districts, the LDP candidate is not going to win. So it's all, especially with this controversy now with what's going on in Tokyo District 28, this fight that the LDP is having with Komeito.
Right. Well, thank you for the details. And yes, I just wanted to ask you one more thing. Actually, you mentioned that Mrs. Abe, she identified Yoshida-san, Mr. Yoshida, as the leader, possible leader of the Abe faction. Is that
No,
what you? No.
no,
So she identified him as a possible contender for the seat in Yamaguchi.
that's right.
I
Yeah.
see. Okay, thank you for that. I just wanted to.
That would be awful ballsy of her to say, and this guy I want to be the leader of the Abe faction. I mean, you'd have 100 people in the Abe faction who would reject that.
Well, if they don't run away, probably that's still, an achievement.
Yes.
Who knows, right? Okay, and then going back to the point about women in boards, company boards. Well, we have a comment there from Hiroko. She mentioned that, basically, it's important to have a quota for women on the boards, because, and then of course my comment there was that almost nothing happens here if there are no quotas.
That's right.
By the government. I'm talking about new things and new ideas, of course. And then Mario goes on, and then it is not the quota, it is the mindset that has to change. If not in society, then at least in business. Women should work according to their business skills and not according to their gender. Yes, so I agree with you very much, Mario. But Timothy, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the Japanese are going to do what the Japanese do. This is a part of culture. Politics and business are a part of culture. And I think there is wider recognition that women need to play a role. But the LDP, the conservatives, the business lobby, it's dominated by men, and it's kind of militaristic in history, in their hierarchy, and how the education system is run with the uniforms and how even Japanese language, the way women talk and the way men talk is distinctly different. And so this power, this way you wield power, the way you generate power and gather it and collect it, I think in contemporary Japanese society, the women are just not trained. They don't have that expectation. But boy, there have been some really powerful women that have come up through the ranks and have displayed it. But you've got this backdrop, and you see this all the time within the LDP, dragging its heels on these issues that really don't sit well with them. And I think with the opposition parties, there's much more flexibility there. But certainly the Japanese have to do something. Among all of the other G7, G20 countries, Japan is constantly identified as a laggard in identifying women. I mean, I think of all the G20, Japan scores the lowest in having women contributing in the political and the business arena. So it is something that have to address.
Very much so, indeed. Yes.
I try not to weigh in on it too much. You notice that I couch my words, and I know you do too, Maya, because we like to report on the news. I don't want to make too much of a commentary plus or minus on it, because otherwise those people who hold opposing views, then I become a target of their affection.
Yes, their affection, indeed. Well, and yes, so there is a comment, another one from David. The role of non-elected positions in the USA, such as First Lady, is interesting to compare to the late Abe's wife. So can you make a comparison, a comment there?
What is this? Which David is this?
David Sharp.
Hi, David. Thank you always for your insightful kind of provocative questions. So Abe's wife, I mean, he was the longest serving prime minister. She had a role that she could have played. She didn't move into that. When foreign dignitaries come in, they do provide this other kind of picture of the prime minister and his family life and his social connections and stuff like that, by having the wife attend and the wife taking care of the other wives, if it is if the visiting dignitary is not a female, and maybe her husband is joining her. But Miss Abe, she had other interests that she was pursuing. She ran a bar, you know. She was very controversial because she was um, perceived as something of a ditz, and not very politically attuned. So that didn't work out. Mr. Suga, his wife, never showed up for any official functions. She did show up on the dais from time to time when he was receiving accolades. And then Mr. Kishida's wife is kind of, I don't see her in, I mean, she was prominent at G7. She lives with her husband in the prime minister's residence. But yeah, the first wife of the United States, that's a powerful role. They have offices in the executive office building, which is connected to the White House. Hillary Clinton is, wow, she took that one by the horns and, turned it into, being Secretary of State and a contender for President of the United States. So I think it depends on the culture and the atmosphere and that sort of thing. I think if Miss Abe or Miss Kishida wanted to play a more significant role, there are avenues for them to do that. But you might remember the current empress, Masako, when she became empress, she married the son of the emperor. She suffered terribly under the beratement and harassment of the imperial household to do things this way and sit that way and, do your hair this way and don't speak that way and hold your head like this. She just suffered. I think that's what caused her to have this nervous breakdown. So the environment is pretty harsh, even though you might have an opportunity. And Masako-sama was, she was a power to contend with. She was in the foreign ministry. She went to Harvard. She was a real item. People who were in the role that I play now, before she was engaged, met her on many occasions during that period of time. So, there are pluses and minuses. Sometimes it's better just to shut up and stay in the background, because the guys who are after you or after your husband, I mean, it's just a nasty business. Take a look at what happened with the COO of Nissan. He did a good job under Mr. Carlos Ghosn. He succeeded and became another item, and then he got assassinated. He got kicked out. So it's a rough and tumble world. It's not for those who are faint of heart, for sure.
Indeed, it is. Well, we have another question and two people on stage in Clubhouse. So I would like to ask Yuka about her thoughts and questions first before I continue with the questions in the room chat. So Yuka, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi, Yuka.
Yeah. Hey, how are you? So if we can go back to the topic of, the second generation politicians or the dynasty. So I've just recently heard this system in UK, and then probably in your audience, they may know this much better than I do, but I've heard that, so in UK, the second generations are not allowed to run for the office in the same office or same district as their fathers are. And it seems like that will, to make sure that, if they can win, they're going to, the second generation, they can win on their own merits. Do you think something like that can work in Japan?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
First of all, Dad is going to stay there until he retires. So they're going to hold on to the power as long as they can. And having survived, 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 election cycles, that's a big deal. And to turn that over after a career of playing politics, there's just too much goodwill that just evaporates. So I think the vessel for that, somebody wants their wife or their son to continue in that because they have such a leg up. They've got such an advantage. I mean, look at Mr. Kishi's son, his oldest son. He retired from being the Minister of Defense. It was a shoo-in. The endorsement of Miss Abe for Mr. What was his name, Yoshida, to take that election position after Mr. Abe died that was a shoo-in. I mean, there's nobody else that's going to even come close. Yes, Mr. Yoshida Shinji. So I think, given Japanese culture and this Giri Ninjo kind of way of doing things for people, yeah, it's kind of hard to envision, and I think it would continue. Plus, it would require the LDP from voting on that kind of a stipulation. I mean, look how much trouble they had just on 1010, on gerrymandering, on the Supreme Court wagging their finger at the LDP, saying this is almost unconstitutional. It's actually should be considered unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court just didn't have the guts to say it is unconstitutional, so fix it. They said it is in a state of unconstitutionality, which is pretty crazy language coming from the Supreme Court. So I don't think it's going to change anytime soon.
Okay. Oh, I know. I'm sorry. Just quickly.
Go ahead.
I just want to. Sorry. Very quick. I promise you.
You don't have to be sorry.
Last week you mentioned because of, this with the sort of with respect to the increase in the child birth rate, you said that in vitro fertilization may be available for free.
Yeah.
Did you say that?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Is it really going to be like?
So as it stands,
because you know how expensive that in the U.S. like 200,000 and more.
Yeah.
I'm like, so if that's free, that's amazing. That's what I thought. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So it is not free now. I think what you would pay out of pocket is around Sanjumayen here, which is about 300,000 yen for that procedure. And I think if it doesn't take the first time, you might get the second time without any additional cost. So the Japanese government is already supporting and supplementing that. So the idea is that it would go from you co-paying or you paying part of it, because it is somewhat elective, that procedure. But I think that they would say, even though it's elective, you're being encouraged and you won't have to pay anything for it. So that's also on the books. But as it stands right now, it's nowhere near what it is in the United States, for sure.
Well, people may want to visit Japan just for that. But anyway, thank you.
Yes, we have a comment actually on LinkedIn about the election system. So by David Malitz on LinkedIn, and he comments about that, saying Freedom House, by the way, ranks Japan as considerably more democratic than the US.
How about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting statistic or a ranking. So I haven't heard this before, but it seems that some organizations do have different opinions and come to different conclusions when compared to, let's say, the mainstream. Okay, and then
great observation. Let me just chime in, if you don't mind, Maya. That yes, the United States clearly has issues with elections, with democracy. There, it is just going through tremendous turmoil over the last maybe 12 years. Starting with the Obama administration, 2 terms for the Obama administration, then Trump, and then the Biden administration, and all of the controversy and the Hillary Clinton, really clawing to get that nomination for president, and all of the stuff that's coming out now, the deep state, the FBI, the Justice Department. It really is such a horrible distraction, and I wish the United States would ultimately get their act together. So this evaluation by, what is it, Freedom House, that democracy is more representative in Japan than in the United States, it doesn't strike me as terribly off the mark, although it's not my area of expertise, but it is a sad thing to hear.
Well, thank you for the comment. And let's go back to Clubhouse then. So Bruce, I know that you're there, but please let me go back to the comments, because I try to do everything in chronological order. So here we go with okay, just a moment. Yes, okay, from Han Nguyen. I have a question about the efforts to increase gender representation. It seems there are a lot of top-down decisions and policies by the government, but are there any policies to promote a better work-life balance?
Yes, these are ongoing all the time. Stay-at-home husbands, work from home. If you do have a baby, you have the husband or the spouse, the working spouse, has time off, sometimes required time off. So these things continue to come up. There are increasing efforts by the Japanese government to supplement and to subsidize certain things, because although the Japanese government generates a lot of money from international exchanges and just from the economy here, it also spends a lot, just the debt servicing. But if they're going to spend 4 trillion yen every year for defense and 3.5 for child rearing, there is money available to increase and to encourage people to make certain decisions. And yes, so there are programs there. They're constantly, that's one of the things that occupies members of the parliament, occupies people like me who are doing lobbying on behalf of companies who are selling services or products to encourage the Japanese government to make a decision on this particular product or this kind of service because of the benefits that the Japanese society or large portions of Japanese society will receive that are better than they are right now. So there's always a lag between technology and the administration of how that technology is imported. So usually technology flies far quicker, and then the administration of that, the acknowledgement or the adaptation of it, like look at my number. My number is a huge issue, but technologically, I think they're running up against problems with it, but administratively, they still haven't come close to distributing this kind of technology throughout the Japanese government, certainly, but throughout the entire Japanese population. Although there is, I think, maybe 80% of people have registered for the My Number system. Not everybody, but it's a pretty big number.
It is a pretty big number, yes, indeed. Well, thank you for that. And Bruce, omatase shimashita. Sorry for keeping you waiting.
Not a problem.
Okay.
So, Timothy, when you actually started working as a secretary in Diet, that's actually when I first came to Japan, and I lived in Yamaguchi for 2.5 years.
Wow.
And Yamaguchi actually punches above its weight a lot of, in terms of influences, or my impression is. And so you talked about like the reduction of seats, but so the Abe family is from Yanai. Abe Taro is from Ube, and obviously made their fortune in cement.
Yep.
Where specifically did this? When did they like gerrymander the seats? How specific were they? Where are you going to take the seat away from?
Okay, that's a great question. So the Supreme Court said, and it's been going on for a while. It's been going on for maybe 15 years. And they finally said, look, the vote disparity in some of these rural areas, like let's say Yamaguchi, the weight of the vote for people who vote in Yamaguchi is 2.3 times what it is in, let's choose Tokyo. So Tokyo is highly populated. There hasn't been any increase in the number of Diet seats there. There hasn't been any increase in the number of Diet seats in Yamaguchi. The only thing that has changed is the number of people in Yamaguchi have all gone somewhere else, like to Tokyo. So the number of people who are voting for the Diet seat in Yamaguchi is smaller than the number of people who are voting for the Diet seats in Tokyo. So they said, you've got to fix this. You need to gerrymander it so that it's more palatable, so it's more representative. And they changed it. 10-10 came up. And the number now is that the people in Yamaguchi, their weight is about 2.1% more, or two times more than in Tokyo. So they changed it, but only by a very minor amount.
But you could take seats away from different places within Yamaguchi. Were they very specific about to like take it away from here, or did it on the prefectural level?
Right.
Just you figure it out.
Yeah, they took it away. 10-10 means they took 10 seats away from rural areas. they put 10 seats in the highly populated areas: Tokyo, Chiba, Kanagawa, Osaka, Kyoto.
Maybe I'm not, but where specifically are the seats coming from?
Yeah, places like Yamaguchi. Yamaguchi had 4 seats. They disappeared District 3. They merged it with District 2. And then that seat came, it's not that seat went to Tokyo or to Osaka. It's just the number that was distributed, and they increased the numbers in 10 other areas.
Okay, so that's actually kind of getting to the question. So I'm not sure. I'll look on where like District 3 and 4 are, because it's like I said, the Taro faction versus the Aso faction versus the Abe faction are different places in Yamaguchi.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, you're gonna have a seat, you're not gonna have a seat, would be kind of a thing that in terms of where you're gonna be able to, your political career is gonna go.
Absolutely. And if you're somebody like Taro Aso and your prefecture has maybe 5 seats or 6 seats, you're going to fight like hell, because probably the LDP member in your district, of the 4 seats that are there, are more likely members of your faction than not, because you've helped them, you've endorsed them, you've stumped for them in their election district, because it's your election district too. So the complexities really grow exponentially.
Bruce, we cannot hear you. Okay, maybe.
Hold on. Now you can hear me. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So question answered. I really appreciated. Like I said, I have a great affinity for Yamaguchi. I lived in a place called Hofu, which is just kind of on the track. But yeah, like I said, it's got a lot of history to it as well.
Yeah. Yamaguchi has produced a long line of prime ministers. So yeah, very important.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And also, as you know, the Hayashi family and the Abe family have been at war with each other for hundreds of years. So this isn't something new. They're always fighting against each other for prominence there. And the fact that they have collapsed Mr. Hayashi's election district to the contiguous 2nd district, that means that he is going to run against the guy who was just appointed through the help of Seiwakai and Miss Abe to be the step-in candidate for Mr. Abe's position.
That's exactly what kind of what I was getting at. Yeah, and I didn't know the Hayashi. They're like, but you go way back, like hundreds of years, and yeah, just America being like just a little baby in terms of these kind of these memories.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, okay. So question and answer, really cool, and I really appreciate these learning about where I'm living. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So just to tie that in a ribbon, I was a Diet secretary in 1982, and at that time, Mr. Abe's father was foreign minister, and Mr. Hayashi's father was an LDP bigwig. I think he might have been a policy affairs chief, but he was very powerful. And the fights that they would have, Mr. Hayashi, Mr. Hayashi, very soft-spoken guitar player. He's a cool guy. His English is great. He went to Harvard. He's really a very astute. What a great guy. His dad was a firebrand, and they used to get into knockdown, drag-out fights all the time. Mr. Abe, on the other hand, was not Mr. Abe's father. Was also very soft. He was very prominent in the LDP faction, the Abe faction. But that was run under Prime Minister Fukuda at that point in time. But the personalities really play a huge role here. And so it's no surprise that Mr. Hayashi's son became, will eventually become prime minister. I believe he's got that kind of charisma, that kind of quality. So it is something to watch out for. Thanks for the question, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Timothy. We have one more question from Ted. You can hear me?
Here's Ted. So I always get the shivers whenever Ted asks a question because I know he knows the answer and he's just testing me. But go ahead.
Okay, so Ted starts with thank you for today's talk, which has been very informative. Earlier, you mentioned the Moriyama faction. Is the head of this faction Mr. Hashiro Moriyama?
Yes.
Or am I getting it wrong?
Yes, it's the older Moriyama.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. So, and Hiroko and Mario, yes, thank you very much for the discussion in the room chat about women in business. As somebody who has worked in Japanese companies for 21 years here, I can say that Hiroko, yes, you're right about that. Women sometimes don't get the opportunity to improve or enhance their skills or experiences because well, of many reasons. I think I don't want to open this door now, but yes, I have seen this firsthand, and I agree with you on that. I believe that other women here will probably agree with me too, and with you as well. Thank you very much for that. And Tim,
let me just throw something in there. So it is incredibly difficult for women. It is incredibly difficult for men.
Yes.
So this corporate battleground that you enter when you finish university and you're ichinensei and you have your kohai and your senpai relationships, and you go through that and the bucho and the kakaricho and all of that stuff, it is amazing that you can be even successful there. There's always a contender. There's always somebody that rumors against you, that pulls you down. It is not a very pleasant experience. It's the corporate warrior thing. I've been in several companies here and have dealt with that on at very high levels. It is not easy. Some people lose. So yeah, it's a dirty business. So for women who are not quite, the temperament is not quite as nasty as that. They don't fight like that. They don't have that kind of what is it? That kind of heritage. But you have to fight pretty dirty sometimes in some of these companies are just horrible. They're horrible to work in. But that's the roll of the dice that you got. You left college. You're not going to change jobs. Your parents are going to get mad at you. You just got married. You bought a house, and you're stuck. And so it's a tough road to hoe. So my hat goes off to the women who are in that fight, who are making progress. But for everyone that does, there are hundreds that have fallen off and said, this isn't for me. This sucks. This is not what I signed up for. And that's by design. If you leave, then my position has improved just a little bit as a consequence. So there's a little bit of that going on too.
Yeah, I have an anecdote. It's just an anecdote, but it happened in the organization I worked for until last year. And I think that you are right, Timothy, and Mario, of course, is right. But there is a different thing. There is a nuance there. And maybe this anecdote will actually exemplify it. The point is that I remember when they, let's say they got a new employee there in the company because they needed somebody to work in the general affairs division. So they recruited actually a woman who graduated from the Keio University, right? And then you know how things are in Japanese companies. We always have no, what I want to say is that there is always an introduction, formal introduction in front of everybody, like a chorei, that is the meeting, right? And when they introduced that new employee, so the president of the company, he was very enthusiastic about her and said she comes from a very pronounced university here in Japan, and we expect her to do a lot of things and to do really well. And what happened, even 2 months after they recruited her, she was given just manual tasks.
Wow.
And that is what I mean and probably that's what Hiroko means, that women do not really get the chance to improve their skills, because even though you say, yes, I want to do this and this and this, they tell you, well, you cannot because somebody else is doing it, and you need, to enter this data in the computer, and create a spreadsheet, and that's all. This is the point. I hope that this exemplifies what, how sometimes it is difficult indeed for women to improve their skills because they're not given the opportunity there. Anyway, so but
3 years on a rock, Maya.
Yes, indeed. So I don't want to go into this direction, but I have seen it not just once, quite a few times actually. Yes, Hiroko-san. Yes, that's it. And that's why I also think that the mindset needs to change, but not only the mindset, you need to actually create the framework so that mindset can thrive, and can continue to be or continue to change. Great. Well, with that, I just want to say that it seems that we don't have any other questions, Timothy. Great, good for you. And I want to also mention once again that we're getting closer to the event, the Summer Networking Get Together, or the Summer Get Together anyway, on June the 30th. That's Friday, late afternoon and evening. Timothy is getting very excited about that. He's getting excited about the tour of the diet. I'm getting excited about the dinner after the tour. So if you haven't registered yet for that event, we encourage you to book your seat, go to the reservation site and do it, because it's going to be something quite special. So we have a very nice quiz there and special prizes, and I'm not going to tell you about them now, but you're going to hear about them a little bit later this week, either on LinkedIn.
Maya, please take a bunch of pictures for us who cannot attend physically.
Yuka, I will do that. Thank you for encouraging
Timothy,
me.
can you take photos of inside the diet? Is that?
Yeah. Yes, you can.
And
I'm thinking, so this is the first time I've organized a diet tour for a while. You can take photos there, and I'm thinking maybe to just, maybe have somebody come along to take a camera so that we can show people who couldn't attend what it's like, because the diet it really is something you have to experience for yourself. It teaches you so much about Japan and the culture and the history, and also how Japanese laws get made. So I'm contemplating how I'm going to do that, but maybe the answer there is that we conduct this tour on a rolling basis once a year or something like that, Maya.
Well, I like
the
idea.
Great.
Yes, I like the idea. That one. Yes, thank you, Timothy. Okay. Well, let's see how.
It's not this Friday. It's the next Friday after that, right? The last Friday of this month. And your cutoff date is what? When is your cutoff date for registrations? Because you're starting to fill up pretty quickly, aren't you, Maya?
Pretty quickly, yes. And yes, the deadline is next Sunday. So yes, because we have to communicate the numbers to the events, the venues, and so on. Yes. So I shared the link for reservations in the room chat. Please use it, or you can also find us.
What is the qualification to attend this? What, like, do they check your IDs?
So that's, yes, I have to do that. I have to check. I have to vet everybody. So you have to register, and then I have to vet you, and I have to present this list, and I'm capped at 50 people. And I need to present this list to the diet guards. And as we go through, they might check your bags. They are going to look at maybe a facial ID and check you off the list, and then we're in. And once we're in, I pretty much have a free hand. We will be escorted by a diet guard so that we don't pick up any ashtrays or memorabilia that are laying around. So there are no qualifications. Japanese, you don't have to be a Japanese national or foreign. I pretty much have discretion on who can come in, and it's not very tight. It's just the numbers are tight. So the idea is I'm limited to 50, and I think Maya has made reservations for dinner for 50, about 250 yards away. So we will end the diet tour at the front of the diet, where the diet is in the background. We'll take a group picture, and then from there we walk maybe 200 yards or 300 yards to the dinner venue. So it'll be pretty nice.
Yes, it will be, definitely. Yes. So Timothy, thank you. Yuka, do you have other questions?
No, I'm sorry. Other than I'm so bummed out that I cannot attend. But anyway, next time.
Next time, yes, next time.
Thank you.
And once again, I think I told you, was it you that? Oh no, it wasn't you, but it will be for you too. That once you come to Japan, we may have a special tour of the diet for you only. exclusive.
This being recorded, Maya. Just kidding.
Okay. So, but I'm not going to, to what do you call that? To back, or I don't know.
Back out?
No, I'm not going to do that, even though it's
Okay. Thank you. I'm just kidding. But thank you, though.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So thank you, Yuka. Well, Timothy, it's time for us to say goodbye to everybody. Wish everybody here happy week, a successful week, and thank you very much for sticking with us. That's all for today. We're going to be here on Wednesday at 8 o'clock in the morning when we have the Business Insights podcast with Tim Sullivan, and then next Sunday, once again, 8:20 with Timothy, who is getting more excited. I don't know why, but I guess that's because
I'm excited for a couple of reasons. The diet is supposed to close down on Wednesday.
Yes.
Will it or will it not? There's a lot of things in play for this next week. So I'm looking forward to reporting them to you next Sunday when we get together. And thanks everybody for joining in every week.
Thank you, Timothy. That's all for today. Enjoy Sunday. Happy Father's Day to you.
Oh yes, happy Father's Day.
All the fathers, yes, all the fathers here. So see you next Sunday then. Thank you,
everybody. Thanks, Maya.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
See ya.
See you.